is Benjamin Thompson, and this is my review of the Kinefinity Super 35 Mavo. I've had the camera for about a year now, and I decided to make kind of a comprehensive review, like commentary on the camera, and to help basically people who were thinking about buying the camera, or who just had some questions, or even owners who have had it for a little while and maybe still have questions. So I hope it helps you. I did a review of the KineMax a few years ago, and I just enjoyed the company and I enjoyed the equipment, and so I've kind of kept with them for a little while now, so I think I have some insight that maybe can help people. So enjoy. Chapter 1, the hardware. The unit itself seems made out of a solid alloy. It feels like the chassis itself could take a fall, but the internals are what I'd be worried about when dropping it. The damn thing looks so easy to take apart that if it wasn't working after a fall, it would take like all I had not to just open it right up and void my warranty just to look inside. Don't do that. It's not weatherproof by any means, and I've now been in a couple situations where it started raining mid-shot and I had to put gaffer tape over the top grill to keep water drops out. Those same openings provide for lots of heat dissipation. I've never run into a problem with overheating despite recording for long durations at like 75 frames per second, albeit not in anything more than like 85-degree weather. This is my formal request that Kinefinity include form-fitting rubber molded plugs for its connections. In the future, I could stand a slightly larger camera if it could accommodate recession of connections for further weatherproofing. There's a 2-pin DC in and a headphone jack should you need it. Of course, there's a Wi-Fi antenna hookup, which I've never used. And when I went to try and put it on my recent iPad iteration, the firmware for the app wasn't compatible with the newest version for the iPad. So there's a USB input for the firmware updates and for loading LUTs. Nothing much to talk about there. The locking mechanism above the SSD slot is the cheapest thing on this whole camera. It definitely isn't made from the same stuff as the rest of the camera, and I don't see why. It feels like if the camera dropped, that would be the thing to break. If that happened, however, you'd certainly be able to keep shooting until it could be serviced, as the SSD fits in snugly without the lock. So even if that wasn't there, you'd be fine. You need to be aware that some third-party SSDs, specifically the Samsung 960 Pros, can have protruding screws on them, and they can break that little dust door. Quick and easy and visual, I'd like to see a rubber cover that could fit over the left side of this camera. If you use the Kinegrip, you could feasibly shoot for long periods of time without using anything on this side of the camera, so why not have like a rubber cover for it? If you think about the situation where you're holding the Kinegrip with your right hand and putting an SSD in with your left hand, it's very difficult because you just don't have enough fingers to push the lock. It's a spring-loaded lock to push that up while you push the SSD in. There doesn't seem to be any heat dissipation grills here, but there are lots of places that grit could potentially get in, so why not cover it up? There is another heat dissipating grill on the rear of the camera, and when you put the KineBack on, there's a slot where the air still comes in, so good job there. The screws and the connection for the KineBack are easily taken on and off. They provide you a nice little alloy cover for the connection when you're not using it. The locking mechanism works just fine. You have to be careful that you don't over tighten the lens lock. You could probably damage it. In fact, I think I remember somebody actually doing this on the forum. So don't do that. Like if it's in, it's in. So here's the mic input. Normally it combines both of your channels, but you do get a readout from the split channels. I put a HOSA breakout cable into this, and I break the channels into two, one of them going to a Rode video mic and the other going into a Rode Link wireless lav setup. And I like this. I actually think the sound I get out of this is pretty great. I'll give you some tests to prove it as well later on. So I think the newest firmware update gives valuable information on this little screen, like shutter speed, aperture, etc. The bottom of the camera has a 1/4 inch thread and two 3/8 inch threads. So if you need to get your camera serviced, there are several different locations you can send it to, and that's going to depend on where you live in the world. Anywhere in Asia, you're going to want to send it to Beijing. That's their main facility. If you live in Europe, there are a couple different options for servicing, and you can find that on their website. If you live in North America, there should be a facility opening up sometime this year in LA. And that's a good segue into the customer service. So I've had a few bugs with the firmware, specifically beta firmware, while I've had this camera. And at one point I did try to send an email to sales@kinefinity.com, and that can take up to 10 days really to get a reply. Sometimes it might even be a little longer, and sometimes it'll be a lot faster. The better way is to use their online service forum. If you own Kinefinity equipment, you can be on a private forum where you can get your answers to the questions that you have given by people who work for the company and others who are on the forum who already own equipment. There's also, of course, a public forum where you can make comments or post general ideas and things like that. Okay, ergonomically speaking, the camera has some room for improvement. It's a cube, so there's that. The handle needs to be like more robust, or Kinefinity needs to provide an extended grip for the handle because it doesn't accommodate a full grip. This is one of the cool things, as a side note, on the forum. You have people who are developing third-party things for this camera, so that there's actually a different setup that you can get that's also very light, and it involves a wooden ergonomic grip. Now that doesn't have the battery in it, but it uses a different battery source. So there are options out there. I found my hand cramping a little bit because of the slight strain of gripping with the ends of my fingers. My fingernails have actually created marks in the handle. I hold it like this. Also, the placement of the record button is one of the main reasons for hand cramping. It needs to be tilted forward. The handle strap is like a lifesaver. Of course, you have to look at this camera at all of its ergonomic shortcomings through the lens of how light the camera is. It weighs 2.1 pounds, okay? That's a 0.3 pounds less than a 11-inch MacBook Air, okay? Just picture that. My entire handheld rig is a little over 5 pounds. It's wonderful. The KineBack. The KineBack weighs 1.2 pounds. I weighed it. It's made from the same material as the camera. In the top is a port for the Dark Tower wireless systems, and someone needs to do a solid review of this system because I think it's one of the most exciting aspects of the camera. There's a door that keeps out dust and other gunk. There are 2 XLR plugs with locking mechanisms that face up, which is a no-no for dust and water, but they give you great plugs that work fine to prevent that. It has 2 3G SDI connections on the side. That's great. Obviously, I don't use them. There's a port for accepting externally generated time code. Great, never used it. There is also a DC out for powering other devices, I assume, that I have also no need for. As you may guess, I also never use the sync port, which you would use to connect the camera to another camera for 3D recording. Again, because these ports are used so minimally, I would love snug rubber plugs for these, similar to the ones that they give you for the XLRs up above. They'd probably never come off. I treat batteries like lenses with this camera. If I'm going to buy a battery, I make sure and check with Kinefinity or other Mavo owners to make sure that it's going to work with the KineBack. Most do, some I've read do not, though I haven't experienced this. Kinefinity does have a pretty good deal on their website for compact batteries that you can buy from them when you get the camera, and their small form factor. Okay, it's time to admit something. In a year of owning this camera, I've never actually needed the KineBack. That being said, I have tested it, and the XLRs seem to produce great audio. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. 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 And by the way, I'm in a room with a window. I'm not in any sort of sound isolation room, so that's it. Okay, bye. Sally sells seashells on the seashore. Sally sells seashells on the seashore. Sally sells seashells on the seashore. Sally sells seashells by 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 the seashore. Sally sells seashells on the seashore. Sally sells seashells on the seashore. Sally sells seashells on the seashore. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. Yeah, so anyway, this is it. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. 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 While we're talking about audio, let's talk about fan noise. You can adjust fan speed to your liking, and I usually keep it at 40% and run without issue. If it were a very hot day and I were shooting high frames per second, I might turn it up. Someone posed the question of whether the camera gets hot. This is sort of a hard question to answer because the camera's heat level is going to change dramatically based on many factors. How hot the environment is, how long your takes are, what frame rate or resolution you're recording at, what's your fan speed. Here's a test of the sound levels from a dB level app from my Galaxy S9 Plus. Okay, the monitor. I can't give you a good review of the Kinemon monitor because I don't use it. For my monitor, I use a small HD focus. I like it because it uses its own batteries. So essentially the camera lasts longer on its supplied batteries, which works for me because I'm running off the Kinegrip like 99% of the time. So you can watch lots of reviews on the small HD focus. I've used it without a hood in very sunny environments and it's worked wonderfully. One issue is that if you use the 750 batteries with that little monitor, you can't lay it flat on this particular mount because it contacts the lens when you do. I carry one of the thinner batteries with me in case I really need to do that. It obviously provides several extra tools that I can't get from the Mavo. Again, watch the reviews. It also has a small form factor. Comes with a pain in the arse thin cord with a female end. Ridiculous. I was able to use this better cord that I bought for like nothing. And with a little light sanding, it fit right into that little slot in the monitor. So you can do that. And I would suggest it. If I could run this to the front port on the Kinefinity instead of the HDMI in the back, I'd be very happy. Or even better, if Kinefinity released a better monitor, which I think they are planning to do, so I could sell the small HD. I'd be really happy. I don't mind sacrificing the extra battery power to get rid of this cord. Quick note, Kinefinity. If you do create a new monitor, consider integrating an optional battery mount for this exact purpose and turn it sideways so it can flip the monitor back farther. Or make a slightly taller mount system. Also, I think it's well worth buying a little HDMI right angle adapter if you are going to connect using the HDMI hookup in the back. Okay, on to the Kinehancer. I still really like the presence of a Kinehancer. It gives me such a sigh of relief that I always have a barrier between my sensor and the outside world. I do lament the fact that there exists glass between my sensor and my lens, but you can't have everything, I guess. I got a question about what lenses work with the Kinemount. I haven't run into any lenses that don't work with it, but that doesn't matter because based on what I've read, there are definitely lenses that don't work with it. I've seen some discussion online about the Sigma Art lenses and incompatibility. I can't personally confirm that, but I would urge that if you aren't sure, check with Kinefinity's lens whitelist. If it's not on there, check around to see if you can find someone who has done it already. Moving right along. Okay, the Kinegrip, the battery door for the grip. You might be concerned that it's just a clip holding it in there and no actual cover. Don't be. It's super convenient, and the battery is recessed enough that it doesn't touch the ground. Not to mention that the grip isn't permanently attached, so if by some act of God you fried your grip, you can get another one without replacing the camera. The buttons, I'm not too crazy about the exposure of the buttons. Because they face up, they're more likely to get something caught in them over time, or if you're shooting around a lot of sand or dust, I think this little setup would be better served with some sort of rubberization. Make it look like the top of a Canon or a Nikon. Again, though, it's on the handle, so if you really screwed it up, you could buy another handle. Okay, field usage. My whole rig consists of a Mavo with a side grip, a Samsung Evo 512 gigabyte SSD, one thick micro HDMI to HDMI with a right angle adapter, an EF Kinehancer, an NPF 750 Sony battery, a Kine battery in the grip, a Manfrotto 500 series quick release plate, a Rode Link, a Rode video mic, a Hosa breakout cable, and 2 cold shoe mounts. I use a Serway 3204 carbon fiber tripod, which I love, and a Liebeck THX fluid head, both of which are small and light. A quick note on why I love this tripod. It works so well for small setup stuff. It's the only high weight capacity carbon fiber tripod that's 21 inches. And this makes a big difference if you're putting it in a pack. It doesn't jut out so much farther. If you're going somewhere, you can just sit down with a pack on and it's just so much better. So I really recommend this tripod, especially for lightweight one-man setups. My current handheld rig, again, weighs 5.7 pounds. And if I add the tripod and fluid head, it weighs a total of 12 pounds. Of course, add on the weight of whatever lens you use. I'm very tempted to switch to a Nikon mount with a Kinehancer because the lenses are super light. I transport everything I need in a Mindshift backlight 26-liter photographer's pack. Everything. Okay, let's get into the internals. Turning on my camera takes right around 30 seconds. That's from pressing the button to actually being able to record. Basically, when the battery voltage at the bottom stops blinking. Turning off the camera at this point takes just a tad over 12 seconds. Okay, let's look at the interface. This is what the UI looks like. I actually think this UI could be better. Compared to some other cameras, I think the numbers should be bigger and easier to see. Now, currently in the menu, you have the ability to pick one of the two menu options, one with and one without settings. If I had my choice, I'd like one more mode that only shows a few integral metrics. Your quick controls on the Kinegrip each have one or two associated controls, like ISO and frames per second are on the same button, and so forth. After 1 year, no joke, I still sometimes mess up which quick button does what. I would color code these to give further association, like make ISO and white balance brown and the resolution and the frames per second orange, and so forth. Earthy colors that are not distracting to your eye. An easy firmware upgrade, I'm guessing, maybe. And group them. All commands are on the top. Pushing left should pick the ones on the left. Pressing up should give you the ones in the middle, and right should give you the ones on the right. Make live view into LV and put it on the bottom. Here's your presets. I love them. They always have been a strength of this camera. They're easy to access, and I switch between them flawlessly all the time. A few notes on playback. I've never been able to find any way of deleting existing clips. This would be real nice because there's always that time when something exciting is happening and you don't have enough memory left to record it all, so you want to delete some throwaway clips, or a situation that has happened multiple times. I start recording a good scene only to realize that I forgot to rebuild the SSD. So now I can't utilize the full storage because it's chock full of old clips that I no longer need, but can't erase. It would also be nice if the menu numbers change color in the playback mode. When you're moving quick and doing multiple takes on static scenes, sometimes you don't realize that you are in playback mode. Or if the menu could actually show you the metadata of the clip you recorded. Currently, it only shows whatever your live settings are. I have needs, people. Menu. I actually like the menu. I think it's clear, simple, and straightforward. To me, this is a cascade done properly. When you bring up the first menu, you should not be bombarded with options. Notice they could use the entire vertical menu space, but they only use half. Good choice. You can find what you need pretty quickly with the controls on the Kinegrip or the side. Here's where they put your codec options. I'll go over these in a little bit, but it's nice. It's a nice selection. Here's the slate stuff. Once the Wi-Fi is back in operation, I hope that it gives an easy interface to create and alter the slate. For obvious reasons, I can't review the Wi-Fi app at this moment, but it could be very useful. For instance, when I was done shooting the snow scenes, I had placed a thick waterproof bag over the housing and had to do the best I could to change parameters through the bag. If it would have been much better to do using an iPad or iPhone in an OtterBox. Here's hoping. The custom sensor frames per second is awesome that it goes this low. You now have another creative tool for any number of things. Time-lapse, hyperlapse, what have you. If you really think about it, that option saves you from having to bring a DSLR in some shooting scenarios. So once you choose them, they will become available as options in your frames per second list. They added project blanking, which I was super happy about. I think most creative professionals will really appreciate these options. You can choose your image format here. This is really just nice to set up your presets. Here's the EI ISO menu. ISO highlight stops. You're damn right we're going to get into this because it's really interesting, and there was a recent long debate over this on the forum, so I'm going to do my best to clear things up. Here's where you save your presets. The custom white balance works well. Get a gray card from a source you trust. I grew up just outside the Codec facility, so they're my jam. There's a histogram. It's nice, but frankly, I never use it. The zebra options are great. I'm not a big zebra guy myself. I do use the magnify quite a bit. Frankly, I really only need the 100% option to make sure that I'm in focus. You can use them while recording or during playback, so that's nice. You can use anamorphic lenses, though I haven't, so there you go. Luckily, the firestorm of complaints about the lag has pretty much died down because people have realized that if you put the camera in 60 frames per second for the video output, it's fine. I put it in 60 frames per second setting when I got the camera, and I've never touched it. But just for you sticklers, here you go. As you can see, at 48 frames per second, over the span of 35 seconds, the camera will vary between 0.10 and 0.22 seconds of delay. Not too bad. Shutter mode. Pick your poison, degrees or seconds. I'm a seconds man myself. This gives you the option of a full list of white balance Kelvin temperatures. If you're doing run and gun and you don't have time to custom white balance, it's nice to have this option. These are all things you might adjust once in a blue moon. Though I wouldn't mind a quicker shortcut from brief to clean, which takes the settings off the screen. I tend to record to NTFS because I use both a Mac and a PC. This creates a loop so that when your clip finishes playing, it automatically starts again. It's actually a good option to have. So this is the power threshold. I have it set at 12.5 volts, but when my batteries are dying, I've been able to continue recording even down to like 10 volts. The new firmware that has come out that I haven't put on yet, I think it has a hard stop option for voltage. And I think there's a countdown as well to that power threshold. So essentially if you're recording and you are about to hit it, it's going to give you a countdown so you can wrap up. I also wanted to touch on something that's one of my favorite parts of the camera. That's the suspend mode. A lot of times when you need to preserve battery life and when you're going from scene to scene, you can just press that suspend mode and you don't have to wait 12 seconds to shut down, the 30 seconds to reboot, and you can preserve battery life between shoots. And there's a shortcut key on the Kinegrip to go straight into suspend mode, so that's great. Just to very quickly backtrack, they also give you a lot of guide options that can be shown on your screen. I don't use most of them. They could be very useful depending on how you work. The only one that I actually really wanted was the bubble level, and that's the only one that doesn't seem to work, so maybe in a future upgrade. If you press the select key in the middle of your Kinegrip when you're in live mode, you'll get a waveform monitor on a fifth of the screen, and you can select whether that reflects post RGB, basically after you've added in a LUT, or the raw data. I tend to use the one that comes up on the small HD because it can cover the entire screen and I can change the transparency. But if you aren't using a small HD, then that's something to think about. Okay guys, here's the chart I made to explain the differences between ISO and EI and how highlight stops factor in. EI, or exposure index, is pretty simple. Changing your exposure index will not affect the analog signal. EI places your camera at its native ISO no matter what you do, so that you are always acquiring the widest possible dynamic range. When you change EI, you're only changing the digital signal. You'll see these changes on your monitor or your EVF, but they're not affecting the raw image. Your actions are what are affecting the raw image. When you change your EI, it will appear as if the scene brightness has changed on your monitor. It is only when you react to this by physically changing the aperture or adjusting the lighting that the actual image will be affected. Kinefinity warns you in their manual not to use EI unless you fully understand it. And they do this because they understand that if you do not have enough light in a scene to accomplish proper exposure, or there is too much light and you haven't compensated for this by stopping down or using shade or a filter, your final image is going to suffer because the camera is going to record at native ISO no matter what you do. As a result, you may be over or underexposed, and sometimes no amount of work in post is going to bring it back, raw or not. So how do highlights factor in here? Well, your highlight stop setting is useless here. I personally think it should be grayed out in your settings when you're in EI mode because it won't affect your image. Instead, your EI settings are going to dictate the balance of your dynamic range. If you increase your EI value, you will increase your headroom, giving you more stops between your analog clip and middle gray. This pushes down your middle gray, giving you less stops in your shadows. The opposite's going to happen if you decrease your EI. Your shadow stops will increase, pushing your middle gray up and leaving you less stops in the highlights. There's an important distinction here between EI and ISO. If you push your ISO past 800, your middle gray isn't really going to change. That's why they give you the highlight settings, so you can use those to adjust your dynamic range balance if you're in ISO mode. By contrast, if you're in EI mode and you increase your EI above 800, you will progressively increase your headroom until you hit some ceiling that I'm unaware of, probably 6.6 stops, but don't quote me on that. On the top, we got ISO. If you go into your camera's sensitivity settings and select ISO, this is how your Mavo is going to work. Your native ISO is 800. If you shoot at that ISO and you leave your highlight settings at 4.3, the default, you will have approximately 4.3 stops of headroom. That means 4.3 stops between middle gray and where your sensor clips, also referred to as your ADC clip, your analog clip. If you increase or decrease your ISO, the amount of stops between middle gray and where your signal clips will not change. Your dynamic range will also not change. According to Kinefinity, until you reach a high enough ISO that introduced noise begins to degrade your image, you won't lose dynamic range. In the Terra 6K, this is around 2500 ISO. I'm not really sure where it is on the Mavo. I checked on the Chinese manual and I couldn't find it. So anyway, it's probably a little higher. When you increase ISO, you're effectively adding gain or boosting the analog signal before it reaches the digital processor. So now let's talk about the highlight stop setting, which only applies, again, to ISO mode. It's important to know that no matter what I change in my highlight stops, my dynamic range isn't going to change. I'm no longer affecting the brightness of the image. I'm only affecting the balance of my dynamic range. In other words, how many stops I have in the highlights and how many stops in the shadows. The camera will be set to a default of 4.3. Again, this is Kinefinity's recommended level to give you the most balanced amount of stops in your highlights and your shadows. If you increase this number, you will increase the headroom, or the amount of stops between middle gray and your analog clip. For this to happen, middle gray will drop, providing you a lower amount of stops in your shadows. By contrast, if you decrease the highlight stops, the opposite will happen. Your middle gray will rise, dropping the amount of stops in your highlights and raising the amount of stops in your shadows. You are going to find that if you raise your highlight stops, your minimum ISO will also increase. For instance, if you increase your highlight stops to 6.6 all the way at the top, you won't be able to drop your ISO below 1000. Okay, so you should ask yourself, how is it possible to change the location of middle gray without changing ISO or adding light to my sensor? The answer is it's kind of not. There's no free lunch, people. Here's what's going on. You start at that 4.3 stops. There's your middle gray. Here's our native ISO, okay? Well, a couple of things are happening simultaneously when you change that highlight stop setting. If you think back to EI, to your exposure index, the screen was getting brighter, but the analog signal didn't change. So you would stop down your aperture or you would add light or whatever to get back to proper exposure. Well, in this case, your screen has gotten brighter, but at the same time, your analog gain has dropped. And you don't see this. The ISO number is not changing. But these two things happen simultaneously and cancel each other out. The screen gets brighter, analog gain drops, and it appears as if nothing has changed except that you have gained headroom. Now you might ask yourself, well, I gained headroom, but my dynamic range it didn't suffer? How did my dynamic range stay the same when I changed my highlight stops? Well, what happened was another thing, which is that your shadows were boosted via an adjusted curve to get more dynamic range in your shadows. As we can see on this third bar, if you notice at the bottom, I extended it down so you have the same amount of dynamic range as you did when you started, when it was 4.3 highlight stops. But because you adjusted your shadows were boosted, because that curve was adjusted, it brings you back to full dynamic range. And you can tell this because at that in those higher stops, the noise will increase in your shadows. And this is counterintuitive because you would think, well, my analog gain is dropping, as we can see on the left, so shouldn't my shadows get cleaner? Well, they should, except that now they're being digitally boosted via that curve. They're being boosted, and that's increasing the noise in your shadows. So this is the trade-off. I know it's complicated, but this is what's really happening when you're changing that highlight setting. So just something you should be aware of. If you're like me and you get real meticulous about these things, it's pretty interesting. Obviously, you don't need to go this deep, but personally, I think it's a good thing to understand your camera as well as you can. So there you go. This is a quick wedge test I did with a Kodak grayscale chart. I basically just used the method where you put white at your ADC clip and then just count backwards. So if you count the steps on here, it looks like we have about 14 steps of dynamic range, which is what Kinefinity advertises. So that seems about right. So all of these were filmed using the same lens, that 28mm Zeiss ZF 2.0 that I use all the time. There were a few different apertures, but none of them I allowed to go below 3.2, which via some lens tests I've done seems to be the cutoff point when you really start to get aberration and softening on the edges. I didn't include ProRes 4444 XQ. I just didn't. I don't know. That was just like one step beyond where I was willing to be as far as comprehensiveness. So you'll just have to imagine the difference between 4444 and 4444 XQ. I'm sure you guys will be okay. All of these clips were also filmed in succession in a very short time, so they should be pretty consistent in the ambient light levels. Obviously, it's just window light. There's no augmented light. That dog's name is Coda, and he can't see out of one eye, obviously, and he can't see with the other, so I think he did a pretty good job. So one of the things that I always want to see in a review, but I never really see, is a recording of the actual waveform or the RGB parades of the clips that I'm looking at. yeah, of course I can download them or look at them that way, but who has time for that? I mean, I guess when you're doing your research you might, but God, if you downloaded a clip from every single one of these, it would take forever. I'd just like to save you guys some time so you can just look and see what I'm seeing. And you can kind of see where the noise exists. Obviously there's going to be some compression here, but you'll get the idea. We're gonna do some low light stuff pretty soon, but I thought I'd show you sort of what some of your levels look like when you're looking at a waveform on that 3200 ISO. So now I'm going to show you the RGB parades for each of these clips. That way you'll be able to get an idea of where the noise is, where it's coming from, and in what channel. Okay, so now I'm going to do some rudimentary color correction. It's pretty straightforward. Take a look. I just bring the saturation all the way down, go over to my curves, isolate the limit value, and basically create an aesthetically pleasing black and white photo. Then I go to my RGB mixer after I bump up my saturation to 50, and then I bring up the red, green, and blue output. It's always a little bit oversaturated at this point, so I just pull back to, you know, something I think looks decent. You'll notice I didn't do any balancing, but I did a custom white balance with this, so when I started shooting, and yeah, so I'm just not gonna bother. You'll notice that where there's noise, there's noise. I want you to be able to see where the noise comes through via the same grade. And I adjusted the grade a little bit here and there for different codecs where they needed it, just because they kind of, you know, some require it. But I did my best not to crush out the noise like I might normally if I had to. Lastly, you can see the RGB parade for the graded clips. let's talk about rolling shutter real quick. Here's a perfect scene. Let me set this up for you. It's on a whale watching boat. The boat's moving and rocking, and people are moving all around you, so you really can't put a tripod up. You have a handheld rig, and there's this kid who's playing with little whale toys. She's a beautiful little girl, and it's a great little scene, and you really want to film it, but it's really hard to keep the camera steady. And even with a monopod, it's just tough. As you can see, we get that jello artifact at 74 frames per second. If I could do this over again, I would have done it in overscan 48 frames per second. Okay, let's talk about low light. Here's a birthday party scene. Pretty average. 4K overscan, 23972. It's about the best setting that you're going to get for low light. It's handheld and low frames per second, so you're really going to keep the rolling shutter to a minimum. So here is what ended up being a great gauntlet for low light. I was about to get on a ferry in Seattle, and I noticed there was a fire in the distance. So I said, well, let's go and film it, because it was evening, the light was starting to die, and it seemed like a perfect time to work with a bunch of different codecs and see how they hold up. You know, a bunch of different formats, all sorts of things. So watch this and make your own opinion. So thanks for hanging in there, everybody. My overall sense of the camera is that although there are significant improvements I'd like to see, the small form factor and the lightweight allow me to have my camera and my peripherals in a knapsack. And that really changes my workflow and it allows me to take on creative projects that I couldn't have in the past. So that's very valuable to me. I would suggest that if you still have questions about the camera, go get your hands on one. There's probably someone who lives near you who has one by now. And they're also popping up in rental companies. So the company is gaining traction, they're listening to people, they're updating their firmware, and I think they're gradually becoming something that the industry is really noticing. And that's pretty valuable, and I'm happy to be part of that. So whatever decision you make, good luck on your filming projects, and thanks again for watching.